Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of the platform Let's Talk About It. I'm your host, Jasmine Harden, and I'm here to create a space for Black minds, voices, and culture to thrive. Thank you for tuning in, and let's get into this episode. Hello, and welcome back to the platform Let's Talk About It. This is your host, Jasmine Lynn. I am so grateful for you being here, and I am excited to talk about this episode's topic, which is healing after trauma. This was a topic that was suggested to me by a listener, so I appreciate your feedback, and I hope that this episode is fulfilling to you. And if you are interested in more episodes like this, please feel free to share in the DMs, in the comments under posts, or even in the Q&As that I post with the episodes. I really appreciate all your engagement of all sorts and kinds. And let's go ahead and get started on this episode's topic. I just want to put a disclaimer out there that I am exhausted. This is the only time I had to record this episode. But I felt like it was really important to really utilize some discipline and make sure that I am sticking with the schedule that I originally planned for before I started feeling like this, or before I knew I would feel like this when it came time to record. I talk about having healthy relationships with your emotions and things like that on the podcast, and I feel like it's important to come to this platform with honesty and transparency, as well as utilizing the things that I say to you all and applying them to myself as well, and not only in private, but publicly on this platform as well. So I just wanted to put it out there because I'm human. And I don't know if you can tell how I'm speaking or anything like that, but if you're ever wondering why my voice changes, it's because I'm human. And you're going to get the voice of however I am feeling that day, but my goal is to make sure that I show up and give you the best of what I can give you today. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So like I previously mentioned, this episode is talking about healing after trauma, and I'm not going to go too deep into it just because, one, I'm no psychiatrist or psychologist, and I don't want to speak on this in a way that comes across like I'm an expert, because I'm not. But I do feel like I've had experience with this topic, and I've also witnessed other people experience this topic as well. And I feel like it's something that needs to be talked about more openly and be willing to educate people, because I think we have a tendency to just expect people to know things. Um, and you don't know unless you ask, or unless you look for an answer, or unless you are taught. So I just want to use this as an opportunity to not only provide some thought-provoking conversation, but also to provide some education opportunities for anybody who may not know these things. Especially because I've talked about this, some of the stuff that I've talked about before on the podcast. I've definitely mentioned, and I'll get into that, and I'll mention it when it comes up. But I've definitely talked about some of these things before, so I do genuinely believe that teaching is repeating until learning takes place. Got that from my church. And so because of that, I have no issue at all repeating some of the things that I've said, because I do think that they are important and, again, need to be talked about more openly. So I'm going to start by defining trauma, because I feel like that's a good starting point to make sure that anyone listening we're all on the same page as far as this topic is concerned. And I got this from Trauma Informed Care Resource Center. It's an article defining what trauma is, and it defines it as something that is a result from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. Experiences that can fall underneath these categories of things that could be considered traumatic is physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, which I think is a pretty popular one that most people are familiar with. Childhood neglect, living with a family member with mental health or substance use disorders, sudden or unexplained separation from a loved one, poverty, racism, discrimination, or oppression, violence in the community, war, and terrorism. And the article kind of breaks it down by calling what I'm assuming people in this profession of trauma informed care call adverse childhood experiences, so ACEs, ACE. Um, and that's just a more long, drawn out version of saying a childhood trauma. But for the sake of sounding like I know what I'm talking about, at the very least, I'm going to utilize that adverse childhood experience moniker. And according to this article, about 62% of all US adults have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And only about 25%, which is a quarter of the entire US population, has more than three or more, I should say, three or more adverse childhood experiences. So 62% means over half, majority of Americans have experienced at least one childhood trauma, and a quarter of the population has experienced at least three or more. And what are the implications of experiencing long-term effects of trauma? And based on studies of adverse childhood experiences, they compared participants who had not experienced any childhood trauma or average childhood experience. They didn't experience any ACEs, to people who experienced several ACEs, four or more specifically. And the study showed that people who have experienced four or more adverse childhood experiences are 2 times as likely to smoke, 2.5 times as likely to have a sexually transmitted infection, 4 times more likely to have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is your lungs, 7 times more likely to be considered an alcoholic or consider themselves an alcoholic, 10 times as likely to have injected street drugs, and 12 times as likely to have attempted suicide. So I kind of want to transition and talk about the impact trauma can have on relationships. Um, and relationships include people, communities, and even delivery systems that are designed to support, individual health and social needs. And when a person experiences trauma, their side effects can include feeling unsafe, feeling betrayed, or having a difficulty trusting others. And it can lead to a heightened sense of emotions such as anger or aggression, and or a tendency towards shame, numbing, and or isolation. Within the context of healthcare specifically, it honestly statistically has proven to negatively affect a person's ability to bond with a caregiver, a patient's ability to bond with a caregiver. So are more likely not to seek medical attention in times of need or proactive medical health practices. So I kind of wanted to just define it, give people an idea of what is trauma. There is a science behind it. I will gladly do a whole episode about it if people are would like to get a little bit more clarity on what constitutes trauma. What what are ways I can figure out how to heal from a traumatic experience. So um, I thought that that was a cool little article to utilize for this episode. I'm going to tag some of the information I utilized in the episode notes. So be on the lookout for that if you're interested. But I'm going to transition and talk about the 4 stages of healing after trauma and kind of give you a rundown of that, as well as giving you my thoughts on the points that are talked about. So you can, I will also add the articles that I used for this episode as well for anyone interested. But I roughly realized in my research that there's about 3 to 4, depending on what article you look at, stages of trauma. I will go with the 4, just because the 4 stages were a bit more realistic to what I feel like I have experienced in my healing journey. Um, and it honestly wasn't even a process of like, oh yeah, I'm going intentionally going on this healing journey. It kind of just happened for me um, as I went to college and I became more educated on things. I kind of started putting past pieces together for myself and realizing like, oh wow, like I experienced things that actually aren't normal, and are actually considered traumatic events. And kind of acknowledging, which is the first stage, where what I had experienced and the severity of what I experienced, and giving myself grace for not even being aware that what I had experienced was so disturbing or pervasive. This article talks about acknowledgement being the process of figuring out if the experience was actually traumatic or not. Um, I think that there are a lot of different ways at education, because that was my experience. I can't speak for everybody, but learning was what kind of allowed me to open my mind and open my perspective up to things that I didn't really consider beforehand. Because believe it or not, I think we as humans can be hard on ourselves, especially if you come from a, as they call, BIPOC, or a cultural community of color, or a marginalized community. Um, there are different levels of experiences when it comes to trauma, and sometimes you're born into trauma, sometimes you develop it along the way. And because of that fact, sometimes you can just think things are way more normal than they really are. Way more normal than they really are, until you learn, or until you step away from, or until you leave those environments and you realize like everybody's not living like this. Um, or everybody did not live like how I lived. And kind of acknowledging that whatever happened, whether it was a singular event or a series of events, that shaped you. Like acknowledging that, okay, that event has had a lasting effect on who I am today. And because of that, I want to learn more about how that event affected me, and not really look at it as a like, oh, well, it's me, or oh, I'm just so broken. I can't tell you not to look at it that way, because you feel how you feel, of course, but I implore you and I encourage you to look at it as a learning opportunity. Look at it as a point, a foundational point of, okay, this is a part of myself that I'm learning, and I'm going to give myself as much grace throughout this process as possible while still acknowledging and being accountable for the ways that I have participated in where I am today. And that's not to say that trauma is anyone's fault or that you should take accountability for your trauma in the sense of like blaming yourself, but just acknowledging that the trauma did affect you, it happened, and that by acknowledging it, you are taking power back from it, and you're going to then be in a position to learn how to evolve beyond that moment of your life. I just want to jump in here real quick. I know I'm kind of interrupting the flow of everything, but I just wanted to get on here and encourage any listeners to put some reviews up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, engaging with the content, listening, sharing. All those things are very helpful, especially if you share it on social media. Very, very, very helpful. But also putting the reviews up goes a long way. If there are any episodes, I don't care if you name drop episodes in the reviews and say this is the best episode thus far. I genuinely want your feedback. I want your honest feedback, because as just like with restaurants and just like with anything else, the reviews matter. Other people who may not follow me on Instagram, or who may not know, who just come across the podcast, being able to see listeners commentary on the podcast can kind of give them an opportunity to gain a little bit of insight from the listener point of view. I love looking at reviews on podcasts when I'm looking at new podcasts, because sometimes it doesn't take much for me to get turned off from something. If I don't want to hear it anymore, I will never listen to it again. And sometimes all it takes is one take. So I just know that when there are good reviews, it can kind of make me a little bit more confident, even if the first thing that I listen to isn't necessarily something I identify with or I enjoy. I'm still more open to give the podcast a chance to woo me. So if you have been wooed, please woo it up in the review section for the podcast. It would mean so much to me. Let's go ahead and get back into this episode. So the next stage is what they call safety. And I'll read from the article. It says, safety is perhaps the most difficult part of the trauma recovery process. If you do not feel safe in your body, environment, or relationships, then you will not be able to be healthy to, excuse me, then you will not be able to healthily process the traumatic experience. It's so important that I will repeat it again. You cannot process your traumatic experiences until you feel safe enough to proceed. In this stage, you must focus on creating safety in all aspects of life. The goal is never to guarantee perfect safety, because that's not attainable. Nothing in life is perfect. Focus on creating sufficient safety that allows you to relax enough to trust the therapeutic process. In therapy, we create safety in relationships, your body, your mind, and your environment. It is important to remember that you may have to work very hard to feel safe, and yet it may still feel hard to process the trauma even after you feel safe. The hope is that you feel safe enough to slowly process the trauma, while also feeling comfortable enough with your therapist to express the limits of your internal sense of safety. A trained professional will help you return to a safety psychologically and make sense of what triggered you. So, this is specifically talking about, of course, having a therapist or having a licensed professional being able to help cultivate that safety in your life and create that safe place and safe space for you to process what you need to process. But it goes beyond the room of a client and their therapist. Like, it goes beyond just that one relationship. It affects trauma. I cannot emphasize this enough, which is why even the article wanted to overemphasize that you literally cannot process your trauma until you feel safe enough to do so. So, if you think about the implications of how serious that comment is, you're not able to process your trauma if you're still in the relationship that traumatized you in the first place. You're not able to process your trauma if you're still living in the environments that traumatized you to begin with. You're not able to process your trauma if you're not able to decipher what seemed real when you were being traumatized versus what is real to you now that you realize the trauma happened. If you're not in a space to be able to decipher those two things, that means you're not in a safe space. If you're not in a safe space to be able to process all that you've experienced, then that should be a cue for you that maybe some changes need to be made. I can't tell you where those changes need to be made because I don't know. You may not even know. I know when I was going through it, I surely didn't know. It was definitely a trial and error. And I was just blessed enough to have been in a position in my life where I had people around that wanted that for me. And even though my environment wasn't necessarily conducive to the growth that I was trying to attain at the time, I still had a strong enough support system to be able to help me get my grounding again. And I'm indebted to my support system for that because without them, I wouldn't be here. Literally. I wouldn't have never started this podcast. When I came up with the idea of the podcast, it was during the time in which I felt like I was genuinely beginning as an adult to enact my journey, my healing journey. I was very determined, I was very serious, and it was a priority for me at that time to really begin to focus my energy on my healing. And I kept putting the podcast off. I was like, I don't even have the bandwidth. I'm still trying to get myself together. I'm not confident. I'm still insecure. I'm still dealing with so many things that I don't even feel like I can start this podcast right now because I can't even conceptualize my mind getting up here and talking to people like people really care about what I have to say. And I was just so in my head and I was just so doubtful for myself, and I knew like that wasn't the time to start it. And that was me giving myself grace, at the time I felt like that I didn't. I felt like I was just not equipped or capable, and I don't think that's what is true, but at that time that's how I felt. And I recognize now that I had it in me all along. The biggest thing that was holding me back was me and my trauma and those things. So I'm going to move to the next stage, which is consider process. And you can only process once you have a safe environment. And I feel like for me, I'm still in the processing stage, to be quite honest with you. Like, there are still moments that I really have to humble myself in a way and realize, like, okay, I thought I was healed, but I am not healed. I'm still healing. And that is something I say all the time. I'm healing, not healed. And I'm typically saying it in a funny way. It's typically in a moment of like people are provoking me and I have to kind of like back myself away, like, remember, we're healing, we're healing, we're healing. And then I have to remind other people, like, I'm healing, not healed. You may not want to poke the bear. But but literally, it's the truth. Like, giving yourself enough grace to recognize, like, yes, I am on this journey. Yes, I have goals I'm trying to reach, and I have priorities that are changing as I'm growing. But it takes time to recover from some of the things that you've experienced, especially as you heard. It's it the proportion, the ratio, the fraction, the decimal, however you want to put it, but the amount of traumatic experiences or adverse childhood experiences that you encounter significantly impacts one's ability to function in society and to handle stress effectively and healthfully. And as someone who knows for a fact I have experienced more than one, I'm not going to name how many or number how many I should say, but I know I've experienced more than one. I recognize that I was experiencing these things before I even knew what trauma was. So to think that me at 24 or about to be 24 at least has the knowledge and skills and time and resources and whatever you want to say to be able to heal from the things that I've experienced when I didn't realize I was experiencing these things until not that long ago. It's like, give yourself grace. Give yourself grace throughout that process. And that's not to say that, oh, if you're 34, excuse me, or 44 or 54, that you're less than because a 24-year-old figured it out before you. Like, no, everybody's journey is different. Everybody was dealing with different things. Generationally, things have changed so much in the past 2 to 3 generations. It's actually kind of ridiculous. Like, exponential human advancement because of things like technology and just the internet and everything, all the technological advances that has taken place, information age, all of those things. Like, we are dealing with different things. We're dealing with different levels of pervasiveness. To expect someone who grew up with segregation to be able to process their trauma in the same way that a person who grew up during a pandemic in social unrest and protests and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, you're experiencing two different types of trauma, but there's nothing new under the sun. And all that is saying that we're all human. So, although it looks different, we're all fighting our own battles in our own ways. So, it's not to say, oh, if you only had one adverse child experience and the person who had 5 adverse child experiences was able to pull themselves together and go on and grow and be successful, and you experiencing one are still struggling with that, you're human. That's okay. Like, that's not to put any person or the trauma, comparing traumas. I'm very, very against that. Comparing your trauma to other people's trauma. Where does that get anybody? Nowhere. Chasing our tails, walking around in a revolving door of nothing, wasting time. That's what it is, a distraction. So, never want anyone to listen to this episode and take that away like, oh, I'm comparing trauma, or I'm making it seem like some people's manifestations of how they deal with their trauma are different or better than others. Like, that is us beyond the point that I'm making right now. The point I'm making is that recovery will take as long as it takes. So if you're still in processing, process on, literally, because you can't put a timeline on the things that God wants you to learn from what you've experienced. I genuinely believe that we experience the things we experience because they shape us into the people that we need to be to enact His will in our life. And so give yourself enough grace to know that the things you experience, you're going to be able to pay that forward one day if you stay the course and give yourself grace and go on the journey to be able to realize that although pain is a part of this thing we call life, there are ways to allow it to not be in vain. So the last stage is what they call integrate, which is basically just a shorthand version of saying you identify or integrate the experience into the way that you show up in the world. And how that looks can vary from person to person. That may look like for one person never sharing it with anybody, but being able to show up for other people who experience those things with nothing but compassion and being able to pay forward their experiences by aiding and providing wisdom for people experiencing the things that they've had to go through. Another person's version may be being a spokesperson for a cause. You know, there's no cookie cutter perfect way to go about integrating what has happened to you into your life or things like that. But to be able to especially give yourself and others compassion, relentless compassion, if you ask me, is really important. And finding ways to incorporate how what you experience can long term allow you to give back. Because, like I previously mentioned, I genuinely believe the reasons we go through what we go through are because God has a will for our lives. And in one way, shape, or form, what you've experienced is going to be essential to your ability to enact His will over your life. So, really creating a vision and creating an understanding and a comfort level in a way with the idea of, you know, utilizing the experience to develop you as a human being and part of this community of human beings, whether that's finding other people who have gone through it and being able to help, or whether that's writing a book or being a mentor. There's just so many ways that you can give back to your community after experiencing things like that. And I find in my experience and just hearing other experiences, when you give back to other people, it minimizes feelings of loneliness. It minimizes feelings of uselessness or unimportance. It makes you feel seen, and it makes you feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself. And those are all very, very, very important stimuli that I believe help with people's ability to sustain their mental health and sustain a supportive community and sustain healthy relationships around them. So that kind of is my spiel on that. I know I said it wasn't going to be long. It actually ended up being way longer than I thought it would, but I I'm glad I went on the tangents that I did, because I think it's important to talk about it from a realistic perspective. Like, yes, I want to educate you guys, but I also want you all to feel like you walked away with some more than just textbook cookie cutter information, and really walked away with some wisdom that you're able to either apply yourself or share with others. And on that note, again, please share the podcast with who you feel like, especially this episode. I feel like this episode could potentially be very helpful and relatable to a lot of people. So please share this episode with anybody you think would enjoy it. And I am looking forward to talking to you guys next time. I am signing off and have a good rest of your week. Till next time. I just want to express my gratitude for you taking time out of your day to share this space with me. I hope this episode was meaningful and you leave feeling enriched. I appreciate you for being a part of this community of listeners. I hope you gain some fulfillment out of your day. Please do not forget to go follow us here and on all social media platforms. You can find us on Instagram at the platform LTAI podcast and Twitter at the platform LTAI. Also, share any episodes that you enjoyed with loved ones. I appreciate any help getting this community to grow. Sending positivity your way, this is your host, Jasmine, signing off. Stay safe, stay well, and farewell.